I have created this GitHub repository to share my code. I have spent a lot of time to prepare this workshop, not just this one, to prepare this topic in a series of workshops. And this workshop is going to probably be in 2 sessions. So the first session is going to be more focused around callbacks and promises. And in the next session, we are going to cover the more advanced and the modern technologies and new JavaScript syntaxes that we could use to to have to implement asynchronous operations. So let me open my notes. So this is the README, and I'm not going to read all of it. These are my notes that I have prepared for this session. But before I do that, I want to just really quick introduce myself. My name is Mehran Hatami. I am a JavaScript developer with around 12 years of experience. So back in the day when I started using JavaScript, we didn't used to have such a wide range of different libraries and frameworks. All we had was something like prototype.js and not even jQuery. And even Ajax was totally new. Setting up an XHR request was a really awesome thing because it was totally new. And to implement Ajax, we had to deal with a lot of spaghetti code. For instance, we had to use ActiveX objects. We had to check the browser if it is IE. We had to deal with ActiveX object and stuff like that. But as time went on, something happened. Something awesome happened. Ajax and XHR request allowed JavaScript to be taken more and more seriously. The important part of JavaScript that allowed JavaScript to have this awesome, process, this history of evolution revolves around the way that the event loop works in JavaScript, specifically the way that we can handle asynchronous operations. So all these years, what I have been doing was just deal with this type of concerns and trying my best to keep up with this, with this ever-changing with the ever-changing JavaScript trends. And now here we are. After all these years, now we have something called full-stack JavaScript, something that we didn't used to have. So yeah, this is what I do right now. I am a full-stack JavaScript developer, and in the past 2 or 3 years, I have decided to share what I have learned during all these years in my career. And this is what I really enjoyed, and I look forward to getting more and more feedback about my workshops and to host a better one in the next session. So, okay, sorry for this long history that I went through. Now let's get started. This is what I had in mind was to create this as a course. That's why you see this title here, Asynchronous Programming Course. I have explained the basics in the in Codementor proposal that I had sent, and you have all, I guess, already read that part. You can go through this notes if you are interested. Let me send this link to the using chat so that you could open it. Great. So this is the title that I want to start my thought with. The strength of JavaScript is that you can do anything, and the weakness is that you will. JavaScript allows you to do almost anything, and this is, I believe, is the strength and the weakness at the meantime, which all depends on the way that we use it. So there are a couple of terms just to make sure we, when I cover, the topics, we know exactly what I'm talking about. The first term that I might use is pulling. When calling a function which has a return value, I consider that pulling the return value from that function. When passing an argument, we actually push that argument to the function. So if a function has an argument and it also returns something, excuse me, other than undefined, then you can pull and push at the meantime. You push the argument and you pull the return value. The other term is control flow primitives. Control flow, I guess everyone in this session are totally familiar with this term, control flow primitives. And what it means is it is just a structure that we usually use in a programming language to code using code blocks like if, else, and using different operators, using switch case, for loop, while, and on and on and on. You could, let me see, I guess there are some missing commits here. I haven't, yes, so I have added a couple of links to the, right here you could find a couple of other links about control flow primitives, but it's not a big deal. What it means here that actually control flow structure or primitives allow us to take certain actions based on a variety of scenarios. It allows us to create scenarios using if, else, using functions and stuff like that. So these, just a couple of terms. I thought it is wise to clarify what I mean when I say pulling, pushing, and also control flow primitives. So let's go. The way that I usually host my workshops is like this. I create a project, an actual project in our case, using, for instance, Node.js. I take some notes, and in this workshop, it's again the same thing. I have taken some notes. We are going to cover those notes. But the way that I do I have created those nodes is along with some code. So using comments blocks, and I'm gonna show it to you. But before I go through the first part of my code, what I want to show you here is you could see different folders in the roots directory: async await, callbacks, and generators and qua. Qua is some kind of alternative for Express.js using function generators, and promises. But callbacks and promises are two different, are the main folders or directories that we are going to cover in this session. In every single one of these folders, you are going to find the same exact Node.js application or let's say Node.js API, some kind of CRUD-based API, and I'm going to show it to you in this session, of course. And they do the same thing using all these technologies, all these different syntaxes that we have in JavaScript. First is callbacks, promises, and we go on later. So now to continue. Okay, just to make sure everything is okay, I want to check one more time in the chat if you can all hear me, and if my voice is clear enough, and if my screen is could be seen, as expected. Can you ping me, guys? Awesome. Thank you for the heads up. Awesome. Okay, let's go through my web store. Okay, so let me remove this and close this. Okay, the first is callbacks. And this is a link that I have also put at the end of the README. If you go through that link, you're going to find more information again about control flow primitives and the way that we could, handle errors in JavaScript. So the first topic that we are going to cover is callbacks in JavaScript, what it means when we say callbacks, and why do we need callbacks. So these 4 different things that you see here is, the different attributes that callback has in compare with others. We are going to use the same thing about, same rule for instance, promises and async await generators. Why? Because I believe this way we could compare all these different ways of handling asynchronous operations. The first thing is we are going to explain that, I'm going to explain that with more details, but just to get us started here, I'm going to just read it quickly. Using callbacks conflates the input with output. So just keep that in mind. It is the same as pulling and pushing at the same time. You will see that in a minute, what it means to conflate the inputs with output. The other thing which is really important to me when it comes to callback is it doesn't work with control flow primitives, and we are going to cover that again. So one of the important parts of this control flow primitives is the way that we could handle errors in JavaScript if the code is written not by callbacks in a totally synchronous way. And the other thing that I'm really interested in is how we could implement parallel operations using callbacks. Okay, these are different attributes and different properties of using callbacks. So let's get started. This is a simple Node.js example, and all I'm going to do here is just to show you how this actually works. So back in the day, like when we didn't have Node.js, the first glimpse, the first time that we experienced the concept of a callback was when we had to set up, as I said that before, when we had to set up an XHR request, XML HTTP request. And the way that it worked was quite interesting. And it is still interesting that it allows us to, it might, you might have heard a lot of bad things about callbacks, but if You have the same experience as me. You could remember that at some time, we all, as JavaScript developers, fell in love with callbacks because it allowed us to, do XHR requests without blocking the IO. And this is what I'm going to show you in a minute. So let's go for, before having a quick look into, I'm going to have a quick look into the XHR sample, and we will get back to the Node.js part. So this is the sample that I have here just to show you that the way that we could. So this is in using control flow primitives. When we create a function, we expect that function to return something. So if you want to, for instance, if you want to set up an asynchronous operation using control flow primitives, you have to write your code in a synchronous way. If you don't use the latest, stuff in JavaScript, 2015 and 16, if you don't use promise, async await, and all these great features, you have to either use callbacks or you have to do it in a totally synchronous way. And XML HTTP request also allows us to, it allows us to send, asynchronous requests. Let's just copy. What I'm going to do here is just to copy this piece of code, go into the browser, right? Here, open the developer console, go to the console, paste the code, and hit enter. So this is a function. When we have a scenario, we usually, again, here, we usually need to have the return value. The way that we usually expect a function to work is, for instance, to have a return value like this, equals get data thing. If I hit the enter, what it does, it sends a request to get all of the reviews for that specific user, which is just myself again. Okay. Let's just see if we have this value. Return value is not defined. Ouch, sorry for this typo. Return value. Now, as you see, it is empty. Let's go to the network. Okay. It is totally empty. Now, if there is a flag in this function, if you change that flag like this, true to false, this is going to change. The behavior of this XHR request is going to change. So again, call the function, return value, voila. As you see, when we first called the get data thing, the response was not available, and the function didn't work as we expected. Based on a mindset, based on an imperative mindset. When I say imperative, I mean again, using the basic standard control flow primitive. You call a function to get a value, but this function needs to send a HTTP request to the server and get the data. What it does when you change the value of this from true to false, what it does, it sends a request in a totally synchronous way, which means you have that result right after, in the next line. But what happens here? At this moment in line number 11, when request.send happens, it is totally paused. Nothing works in your browser. The whole I/O is blocked. For instance, if it takes 1 second or if it takes 10 minutes, during all this time, everything is just freezing, nothing works. And that's why it might seem much better not to use callbacks and use synchronous XHR request instead. But it's not feasible to freeze the browser for the end user to have their data, to get the data, because it doesn't make any sense to do so. In some cases, we sometimes do that, but I cannot find any case in my mind, at least in browser, not in Node.js, at least in browser, I cannot find anything that could make any kind of sense to block the I/O, to block the whole browser. So that's why, so this works. Now let's just change that in a way that, okay, the data is totally clear, the URL of this, we send the request to this specific URL and we get the data. This is, it doesn't conflate the input and output. It just has this output, and what you do, you actually pull the data using getDataSync function. Let's re-implement that function right here. Get data. So right here, again, we do the same thing. But when we say open, if we don't pass anything as a third parameter, the default value of that is going to be asynchronous. So all we have to do is just to consider open as a function which is totally, it doesn't have the third parameter. Let's just, the best case scenario to me was that the open function of XML HTTP request objects never had any third argument, and the default value have always been the asynchronous true. So this would have been the best case scenario to me. But now that we don't have the data right after sending the request, the way that we can handle that is just using this type of event. The event is called onReadyStateChange. This is the old-fashioned way of handling XHR requests, by the way. In the modern browser these days, you could do that in a much cleaner way. Using jQuery, you don't actually need to deal with these events. But what jQuery does under the hood is exactly this. We have different, XHR request object, which is this object, has an attribute here, has an attribute which is called a ready state, and it has 4 different values. When you open the request, the value is 1. When you send the request, it changes to 2, and it goes like, if everything goes as expected, and at the end, when you receive the response, then the ready state here, the ready state would be 4. So that's how it happens. It's totally similar to setting up an onClick event. So you add this event onReadyStateChange. Now the other thing, let's just say we have an object in our browser. We have a div element, a button in our page. What we usually do is to add event listener, to add a function, so that when that function is triggered, we want to do something, which means when you add an event like this, you don't expect to have the result or to have access to the event object right after you set it up. So that's exactly the same thing that happens here. When you send a request, the browser waits for this event to happen. And it happens a couple of times. And at the fourth time, if it, it changes the radius state to 4, and that's how it works. Which means at this point here, we don't actually have any data. We don't have the response. So now that we don't have the response, how we are able to get the data? This is where callbacks is needed, which is actually a great feature of JavaScript. It is JavaScript that allows us to, pass a function as an argument. If you scroll up, you could see that here we have an argument called callback. And the type of this function, the type of this callback argument is a function. You could see that here. The same as getData. GetData is a function. Callback is also a function. Do we know what it is and what it does? No, we don't, because at this point we have already all we have done is just to create the getData function. The developer who is going to use this getData function is the one who passes the function as the argument. And so, which means at this point, we don't know if callback even exists, or if it is really, if it is a function. That's why, to be, safe, this is the better, way of handling this. We have to first make sure if callback exists, or if type of callback is function. Then this is going to work this way. If callback is a function, what we want to do is to pass the function, pass the return value to that callback function. This is just, I thought XHR request is going to be more, it's going to be more familiar for you. That's why I thought, instead of just jumping into Node.js from the starting point, I thought it makes more sense to, show you a browser code first. So, and this is exactly a browser-based code. You could copy this code and paste it in your browser, and you will see that it is going to work exactly. Yeah, it is. There is a typo here. This is radius state. Okay. Awesome. For instance, in some cases, we need to show a loader. I'm not going to continue going through this file, but if you want to, you could do that. Just read it, and you could just, change the code. The whole thing here is, the whole point of using this, setting up this part is just to show you, if you do this in a synchronous way, you are not able to show, for instance, a loader, a spinning loader in your page, so that user knows that you are waiting for something. Why? Because if you use synchronous operation, you have blocked the whole I/O, and the page is totally freezed, nothing works. Then even unclick events are not going to be triggered if user clicks on that button during that specific, time window, when you send the request until you get the response, if it is a synchronous request. So if you do this, show loader and hide loader, it's not going to work. It might show the loader, but even if you have this, animations like, GIF animated loaders, that GIF animated image is going to be freezed like just a simple image. So, but in an asynchronous way, the way that we handle it is just, before we send the request, we enable the flag, we show the loader, we call this function right here, get data, and we pass our callback to the function. This is the callback function that we have. And this function is going to be called inside get data after receiving the response. Then at this point, you could hide the loader. So it doesn't matter if it takes 2 seconds or 10 minutes. During this time, your browser is working properly, and browser could do, end user could do, and it, could click on different buttons and open different parts of your application, but you could still show this loader. And once you have your data, you could do whatever you want to do. So this is how it works. Now, let's get back to this file and continue. I'm not going to cover this one part anymore because now we did it in the other file. Okay. To have a similar function in Node.js, the usual example of asynchronous versus synchronous operations in Node.js, similar to XHR in browser, is using fs.read file sync or fs.read file. So fs.read file sync is actually to read a file in a synchronous way, which means it is totally okay with control flow primitives, and it returns the data, and it works exactly as you expect in terms of control flow primitives. But fs.read file without sync at the end, it doesn't actually, yeah, this one. It doesn't actually return anything, which means you cannot wait for the result like data something and decide whether you want to go for, and create a scenario in a standard control flow primitive based structure. So you cannot do this. You cannot decide, you cannot create your workflow using data this way or using the usual control flow structure. So the way that you could do that is just, again, to pass a function. The whole thing here is, if we could compare these two, it's really, really clear. It's similar to the get data sync that I showed you in the XHR sample. What we have here, by the way, I have used a library called present. What it does, it allows us to just to store the current moment in a variable, and it just allows me to compare these two. This is really important if we could cover this. Okay, let's get into it. What I want to do is just to call this function and show you the difference between the started at variable that we have here and this moment. I want to see the value of these two. So let's just call get JSON sync, call sync, call async. Okay, just disregard the other parts. We are going to cover that as we go on. Okay, test. Just, yeah, everything is now disabled as I need it to be. So we have created this function called get JSON sync, which receives a file name. It stores the current moment and a variable called started at. It uses a read file sync to read a file from file system. But it is a synchronous operation, which means, again, it is going to block the current thread. So, and as we all know, Node.js is single-threaded, which means everything is blocked. When you use read file sync, You know, you cannot process anything else at that specific moment. And in this log duration function is just a console log. What it does, it just shows the difference. Again, if you see here, present, just to make it more clear, it is started at, now let's say ended at, equals present. We pass the started at to this function just to have a cleaner output. Ended at. What I do here, I calculate the delta, the difference between these two moments. Okay, get JSON sync is now here, logs the time difference. At this line, okay, the data, the return value is a string. It's not a JSON object. So the function is named getJSONSync, so which means it should return a JSON object. Okay, we use JavaScript JSON.parse function to parse the data here like this. And the reason that I have done it this way is just to be able to console log that. But at this point, I don't actually need it. I could just return this like this, you know? I could comment out the return. I don't have to store the return value of JSON.parse and then return it, because I don't need that in the next part of the function. Okay, this is a function. Function is ready. Let's go to the point that I have called this function. The function is called callSync. What it does, again, using the standard control flow structure, it uses a try catch to handle the error, the possible error that we might have in our code. What it does, a simple workflow. Let data equals getJSONSync, and it passes a string, and this string, as you see here, is file name, which means it is the address of the file that you want to, the JSON file that you want to read and then parse as a JSON. And here it wants to do console.log. Of course, you could do more. You could, for instance, create now simple if-else blocks here. Based on the data that you receive, you could create scenarios. But the scenario that we have right here is just a simple console log. So as you see, it's not a big deal. Call sync. Let's comment this part out. Uncomment this part. So, okay, I see everything is okay. Let's call this. Right, node. Oh, let's do it. Let me open a terminal. CD paste. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is to call the function, the file that we just created. Okay, what is it? Callback.js. Okay, the duration, you see that it took around, I guess it is seconds, based on seconds. Yeah, half a second to read the, you see the result, it is a JSON. It is an array. The result is like this. So what is the difference? This is now what it does. It is a getJSONSync operation. It is a synchronous operation. And now what I'm going to do is just to change a piece of code. Instead of present, let's use a simple date object in JavaScript. New date, that get time. It returns the current, timestamp, based on milliseconds. And here, okay, new date dot get time. Okay, now let's call the function again. Here we go. This time the duration is 0. Why do you think it happens? It is totally clear. Because what you actually do when you use a synchronous operation, you actually pause everything. And the date object, even date object is going to be messed up. If you use synchronous operation, you actually pause the process of calculating the current moment using date object. Yes, if, for instance, if you have a set timeout for 3 seconds from now, and in the middle of that set timeout, you do a synchronous operation, and that synchronous operation is going to take, let's say, 10 seconds to be processed and finished. Your set timeout is going to be called after 13 seconds instead. This is the difference. And the reason that I have used a present library in a Node.js library is just to do, to show you this. Using present, you could, you could just do it in a better way. It doesn't use the date object, the standard date object. It has something else to calculate the current moment. So this is a really important part of understanding the synchronous operations, that using synchronous operations, even date objects is not working properly. You see this here? It has started at this point. It has sent a request. And at this point, it has received, the content of the file. It has sent a request to the API that reads the data from I/O, and it receives that after how much time? After around half a second. So that half a second is missing for date object. But if we want to, the only way that we could do this is using libraries like present. Now let's do the same for the asynchronous function that we have created called getJSON. So again, started at present. So let's just take a quick look into the structure of this function. Okay. As you see, it is using callbacks, and in compare with this code, if I want to remove the extra parts, just the logs and in this, you could, if you remove the functionality of log duration, you could change, write the same code in just one line, as you see here. So even if we don't do that, so yeah, look at this function. This function looks really pretty. It's much easier to read and it's much easier to understand. But let's compare that to this one, getJSON. It does the same exact thing, but it's not synchronous. So as you see, it has much more code, and it has a nested function in it. And let's just check how many times it has to check for errors. One in this point, the other here using try catch, and the other point actually is, yeah, we have to check in 2 different points. Let's just cover this, read the code. Started at present, it's really easy. We all know what it does. We have to create a callback function. Why? Because it is synchronous, and as I told you before, when we use synchronous functions, they cannot return any value. They don't work in a usual, using the usual structure. The way that they work, in our case, using read file in Node.js, they use callback functions. If you want to get the data, you have to call this function and pass another function to that function. So let's just pause for a second. If you remember, I told you about pulling and pushing. If we want to compare these two here, fs.readFile sync, what it does, we actually send a couple of requests, then we pull the data as a return value. It is pulling the data. But at this point, using fs.readFile, we have to push something. We have to push a parameter, and I have changed the name of the callback to something called give me the result. Exactly what it does is you actually create a function that, and you expect, fs.readFile to give you the result using this function called give me the result. So, and just there's one quick, side note. Callbacks could be, could have different type of conventions and structures. In Node.js, we have a standard for that. We have a unique convention for that. Every single, whenever you set up a function which is synchronous in Node.js, that function should receive all of its parameters at first. And at the end, the final parameter should be the callback. So the first part of this standard is that. The second part of that standard is, now this callback function that you have passed to get, to this asynchronous operation is gonna receive two parameters. First, as you see, error in line number 30. The second is data. You don't receive a one parameter, you receive two different parameters. The first one is error. And why do we need that? Is just to make sure if the process of reading that, in this case, reading the file from file system, that process, if that process, has been terminated because of an error, so then this error would be a real error object. That's how in almost every single Node.js callback, we have to check for the error at first. This is exactly, whenever you have a callback function in Node.js, the first line of code in your callback function is usually this: if error, then do something. If you have created, for instance, in our case, this is a library, for instance, the get.json function that we have created is something, it is a utility created by us for developers to be used. So this, again, get.json should respect the same convention that we see in read file. You see, you pass file name, UTF-8, and at the end, the callback function. Your function as well should have the same structure. It only needs one single parameter called file name and callback. You see, the callback is not actually a parameter. The last parameter in an asynchronous operation in Node.js is callback, and that callback is not going to affect, usually is not going to affect any part of the actual process inside that function. For instance, we don't usually do this. We don't use if callback exists, do something like this. A scenario is not going to change based on the callback that you pass, because it is not actually a parameter. It is just a function to be called back, as its name suggests. So let's continue reading. So now we know what it means when I say first error callback. So in Node.js, we have error first callbacks, which means the first parameter is error, and the second parameter, if the operation, the asynchronous operation that you are executing here, in this case, fs.read file, is if this operation returns something, that return value is going to be passed here in the data. This data is actually the return value. Is actually the same exact thing as what you see in line number 21. So what you see in line number 21 as a variable has the same value and behavior as this data argument that you receive in your function, which means it has the return value. So again, as we have done it here, log duration, we do the same here. So at this point, why I have used try catch, because I want to parse that JSON string that I have received. That JSON string, to convert a JSON string to a JSON object, to a JavaScript object, we have to use JSON.parse, and JSON.parse is not asynchronous. It is synchronous, which means I could use the standard control flow structure using try catch to catch the error if any error happens. So let's see. What I have done at first, if error happens at this point, if you see, I receive a callback in my getJSON function, and if any error happens, I call that function and I pass the error object as the first argument. This is again to respect the same structure, and pass null as the data, because when this error happens, it means I don't actually have any data. I don't have any actual result. So the same thing happens here. If JSON.parse, faces with any issues, this is what we should do. Callback. We have to call the callback function, and then pass the error and null as the data. Why? Again, because we don't have the result. Because if JSON string is not, a valid string, is not a valid JSON standard string, so then it's not. This JSON parse is not going to be able to return a proper JSON object. That's why I have to pass return. So the reason that you see this return right here and here, because we want, if I remove this return, what happened is it is going to continue. I could either do this instead of returning. I could create this if-else block, a huge else block like this, or I could just say return callback. That return statement is actually just to stop the process. It doesn't mean returning something. It is just to stop the process, which means you could also do this instead, return, just return. Or again, if you are not comfortable using return statement, you could use if-else statement. If error happens, and if there is no error. But the way that I usually handle that is using this return statement just to stop the process. It gives me a cleaner, look to, it gives my code a cleaner look. That's how I believe it's cleaner. So for some people, it might be different. Anyway, so we have two occasions. First here, the other here, we have to check for the error. Let's get back here. Do I have to do anything? Nope. Do I have to do anything to handle the error? Nope. Why? Because it is using the standard control flow, and the end user, the developer, then is going to call this function, could use a simple try catch to catch any error that could happen here. if the JSON, for instance, if you pass a file name and that file name is not, correct, or if there is no file and there is no file in your file system, using that file name, so then yes, you are going to be able to catch the error using a simple try catch because it is synchronous and standard written. It respects the control flow structure, but this one doesn't. That's why we have to handle the error manually instead. We have to check for error here. We have to respect the convention of first, error first callbacks in Node.js. Again, we have, at this point, even we have to mix it up with a synchronous operation JSON parse to handle the error and pass the error. If we don't do that, the developer who is going to use this getJSON function is not able to catch the error because you don't return anything. It is similar to doing this. If you pass a try catch around, if you do this, if you add a try catch and surround the fs.read5 in your try block, this try catch is totally useless. It's not going to, help you catch any kind of error, unless, fs is not actually fs, or you have some bad code, in your Node.js, which is not the case usually. So this try catch is not going to make any kind of sense. So that's why we have to do this. We have to handle the errors by ourselves. Okay, now I have this function getJSON, call sync, call async. Let me now call getJSON function. So as you see, I want to get exactly similar to what we have here. fs.read file that we pass a function, give me the result. To get the result, we have the same case here. This is a standard. This getJSON function is a standard function, a standard callback-based function in Node.js. So here, call async. What you do first is to first create your callback function. And again, the standard, let me just remove this callback function and create it from scratch. Oh, sorry. Function. What I should do, okay, I have passed, it has a name, give me the results. And then it should receive, again, we have to respect the structure. Why? Because when we do so, now here we could use the same Node.js convention. The first parameter is error, and the second parameter is data. You could name them differently, but the actual values passed to this callback function is going to be first error and the second your response or your data, whatever you want to name it. Okay, the first part, the way that we usually do using callback, again, is just to check if error exists. Then if you don't want to do anything here, you could just do something like this and return or console.log. And now your error. Now here, you could console.log your data. So now now you see this, let me paste the previous code that I had, exactly the same code. Now what we do here, we pass it to this function and call it. Now what I want to do is just, instead of calling this function, let's call this one. Before I do so, I want to check if you have any questions so far, or if you have passed any questions. Nope, nothing. I don't see anything. Great, let's get back to it. Now I want to do, again, I want to call this function using this asynchronous operation. And node, or let's go back to here, clean it. Okay, so here the duration is this number that you see. It is get JSON sync. Why it is sync? I don't know. I guess I haven't saved it yet. Okay, call async. In my call async, because I changed the call log duration to not use present. I'm using the same function here. Okay, so as you see now, the duration is 6, I don't know, milliseconds or something like that. So what I want to do is just to do the same thing for this one. Use date instead of present, right? Log duration started at right here instead of present. New date. That gets time. Save. Let's run the code. As you see now, we have a value for the duration, which means it has taken 1 millisecond to run this code, which means the started at variable has a different variable in compare with ended at, which means date object is not messed up. It is working as it should because you haven't blocked the IO. I guess I have made my point now. The differences between these two, and when I say pushing and pulling. What I want to do here, you could go through all the other parts of this file, but to me, what I want to show you an actual Node.js application using callbacks. In callbacks folder, there is this Node.js/Express.js application. If you open the server.js file, it is just a simple Express.js application, and what it does, it has, it just provides us with a RESTful API /what. You could find the REST in the API folder, users, index. You see that here. It is a simple standard CRUD operation. The first one is index. It returns all the users. Show, it receives one parameter ID, and it returns one single user. I have used Mongoose to do so. You could read the code. But this parts are just the standard parts of setting up routers in Express.js. But the interesting part is user.controller. So if you just look at this, we have controller.index show, create, update again, and destroy. These functions are the actual functions that you need to understand. So these functions are using callback functions. For instance, exports.index. At this point, we have this function, and this function receives 3 different parameters: request, response, and next. Request is what end user sends, what the browser sends when you, for instance, open a web page, or if you send XHR request, or if you send an actual web request from your, from your C# code, then that HTTP request is going to end up, is going to be processed by Express.js and put into this request object. And this response is going to be the object that you could return the result of your process. And next is just part of this. If any kind of error happens, we want to have one single point in our Node Express.js application. That's why we pass next. So when we call next, whenever any error happens, we call next. Why? Because we want this part of our code, error handler. You see, this function is sort of a middleware for error handling. When you call next, it goes right straight into the function. And if you are interested, you could read that later, but the important part is the way that this function actually returns the list of all users. So let's just check it. What Mongoose, so the user.mongo.js is a Mongoose model, and what it does, it allows us to query against the database and read, and the database here is MongoDB, and what we need here is to query against the database and read all the users in this case. So this user object, has all sorts of different APIs allowing us to query and do whatever we want to. For instance, one of which is find. So this object that you see here is the query that you could pass. If you have a parameter, and if, for instance, if the user has a name and you want to filter based on that attribute, you could use it here. But in our case, because we need to return all the users, we don't actually pass anything. But in a real-world application, at this point, even to get the list of all users, what you should do is to pass the pagination parameters. So, but in our case, we don't actually need it. So let's just take a look at this function. User.find doesn't return anything. You see this? Let's just remove this part. Do you see anything on the left side? No, because again, it doesn't respect the standard control flow structure in JavaScript. What it does, it asks you for a callback. The only parameter is this object. This is the query object. And the second parameter argument is your callback that you pass to get the data. So which means at this point here, you don't have the data yet. So let's pause it. Okay. Yeah, what we do here again, as you see, we check for the error. If error, return next error. And in line number 20, what we do, this data, as you see, I have changed the name from data to users because it is actually a list of users. And this is the way that you could send the list of, users, or send a JSON object to your, as a response. If it is a browser, you are sending back the response to the browser. So let's check the other one. At this case, user find by ID, and as you see, it doesn't have anything like this. For instance, var user equals something. It doesn't have this. Why? Because it is using callbacks. So you have to pass this function. Again, you have to check for the error. One more time, it is likely that the process of calling the function, reading or executing the query against the MongoDB database, there is no error at this process, but Mongoose cannot find any users based on that specific ID that you pass from your params, as you see here. At that case, what I want to do is just to call something else. As you see, it is a scenario. If user exists, if this user again is the second parameter which usually has the data. If user doesn't exist, I want to call one function. And if it exists here, I want to send it back as a response. You could read the other functions as well, but I haven't actually created the others. For instance, the create function or the update. I have just added this delay function to mimic an asynchronous operation, because all I had actually needed is just to show you an actual code in a real world application here to get the list of all users, to get one single user. Now let's run this code. The way that we could run it is just simply by opening this npm. What I have here in my package.json, I have different scripts. Callbacks is to call, to run the callbacks application inside the callbacks folder. let's do this. Let's run this, okay. That's it. So as you can see, I have also added a seed data. Seed data has been successfully inserted. I have some, I have a mock data, a list of users inserted to the database so that we could actually see something when we open the page, when we send the request to the API. So let's see what is the result of the API now. 8080. Let's open this browser. Localhost 8080 API users. Voila. Now we have the list of all users. Okay, sorry. Let me see if you have any questions. No, I thought there's a question. Anyway, so this returns a list of all users. And if you want to get one single user, what you should do is just as this is exactly the way that REST works. What I just did is just to copy this ID from one of these objects, put it right after this users, and hit enter. And as you see, it returns Yuda Katz, the creator of Ember.js. So this is, for instance, the user. If we get back to the list of all users, we have different users. If you copy another one, this is the result. So as you see, it works exactly as expected. So now let's get back to the code. What I want to show you to wrap up the session is just to give you, to give you something about promises. Now that we know how callbacks behave, we could get back to the first part and read this notes again. Conflates the input with output. Because why? The way that it just, if you using callbacks, what it does, actually what, for instance, Node.js does when you call fs.read file, at the same time, you pass an input argument and you pass a callback function which receives the output. That's what it means when I say conflates the input with output. Doesn't work with control flow primitives. And it has a really, really, different way of error handling. We have to handle the errors manually. I haven't covered the parallel operations, yes, but just using synchronous operation, what do you think happens when you pause everything for one single operation? It means that you are not able to create parallel operations using synchronous operations. But using callbacks, you could set up parallel operation. This is a great, awesome feature that we really enjoyed as JavaScript developers back in the day when we first used our first callback, because it allowed us to set up parallel operations, because it allows us to set up asynchronous operations. Okay. Now that it makes sense, you could go through different parts. I have created other parts, other examples here, but the important part, we could get back to this later in next sessions. But if you just take a look at this function, you could see this is, if you read the name, a weird scenario in sync, which sounds funny, but if you read the code, you are going to see that it is not that complicated, and it is really weird because it doesn't make sense in a real world scenario. What it does here, but it is a scenario. This is the part that matters. Using a synchronous operation, you could just use a simple try catch to catch all of the errors. You could, have read the data, and you could pick a random user from that data, and then you could get random user file address, and you could even send another request to get the random user private info. And after that, you could even, at every single moment that you call these functions, the thread is blocked. And then when you get the data, it is going to block again for the next operation. And it goes again and again and again until you reach to the end. So, but to handle all of the errors in every single one of these sync operations, all you have to do is this. Now, a similar process is this. It is huge. As you see, I have to check if error, try catch, if error again here to do the same thing. But here I have one single point to check the error. So this part actually sucks, that using callbacks is not, gives us a really bad headache in terms of handling errors, but it allows us to set up parallel or operations, and it allows us not to block the I/O. Now let's go to what I said. What I have done, I have created the same exact file here to do the same thing using promises. I believe you are all familiar with the way that promises work, but this is actually, going to be the main part of the next session, that we are going to talk about promises and the way that now using promises we could handle, we could use yield keyword to set up and function generators along with promises to create something interesting. And this is the key moment, that when we mix promises with function generators, which is a really great new feature in JavaScript, it allows us to, again, respect the control flow primitive, but not to, we could respect the control flow primitive without blocking the I/O. We could have parallel operations, but the code is not going to be, if error, it's not going to be ugly as callbacks are. So we are going to cover that in our next session, but now I'm going to run the same application. Let's stop this one. Instead of this, I'm going to run callbacks promises. So as you see, it works. So if I refresh the page, what happens? It doesn't have any ID with that specific user because it has a different database. Yeah, this is the list of users here. Great. Now it has these users. As you see, it is the exact same thing, from this point. But if we get back to the code, that's, the structure of the folders. Let's just compare these two. Callbacks. As you see, it has API components public, API components public. The rest is quite the same. Server.js is quite the same as what we have here, server.js. But the only part that is different is every single asynchronous operation which we have used callbacks for in the first project, in the first application. Now in this application, we have used promises instead. You could find one of which here in API folder, user.controller. Let's see now how it works. So, okay, all I want to do in this session is just to explain one single function, which is this one. Okay, what we usually do using promises is just to chain using .then, or .catch again and again to create scenarios. But if I want to do this is the part that I have. By the way, I have used a function, a library called Promisify. Excuse me, a function called Promisify to convert this user.find, which is, if you remember, I said this user is a mongoose model, and it supports callbacks. And actually, in its latest versions, it also supports promises using something else. I don't actually need to use Promisify anymore, but because it is another example that we could read into it and talk about it later, I guess it's much better. Anyway, what it does now, this is the function that we have. Instead of user.find, what we do, for instance, let's just create a function. Instead of a callback, the function that reads the data, get users, for instance, this is the list of users. If I want to create a general function like get users, so this should receive a query. In this case, all I have to do is just to do this. Return Promisify user.find and pass the query to user.find. Okay. Now I could use this get user here because I don't have any query. I don't want to pass any. Okay, now I just put it here. As you see, it doesn't receive any callback function. So the way that it works, when we are allowed, when we can chain on the return value of this object, it means it has a return value. So let's just change the code to this way. Let response, now response.then. So there is this, or instead of response, what do we have here? It is a list of users. Let's say, yeah, users instead, user list, user list.then. So as you see, the point that I want to make here is that this get user function, in compare with get data sync or get data async that we had in my notes, it is similar to the synchronous one, which had something to return. It is, again, as you see, our function using promises, our functions always have some, they always, have something to return. But what they return is not the actual value, actual return value that we need. It's not the actual users list. But what it is it is a promise, which means it is an object which is going to be filled in really soon, once it has the data, not really soon, sorry, once it has the data. Once the data is returned, because it is synchronous, we have, this user. Now, instead of user list, it's much better to change that to something like user's promise. So how we could have now wait for that data, or how we could wait for this promise to be filled with the actual value is using .then. Let's just do this as well here. One of my students asked me, okay, it is quite the same. I used to, in a callback scenario, I had to pass the callback to my main function, but in this case, I have to pass the callback to then. But it's not true. It's not a callback anymore. It is, as you see, doesn't have the error object, because using then allows us just to get the, you know, what the function that you see here is going to be called only when you get the result. If any error happens, this function is not going to be called. So, but using callbacks, we have one single function to handle the error and to handle the data. So let me do this just to format the code. The point that I want to make here, using callbacks, we have to push something and we have to conflate the input parameter with the output, you know, return value. But using promises, we don't have to do that. You see, get users object receives an actual query and it returns an actual return value, although that return value is not the actual return value that we expect, but it is a promise of that object that we need. So it's much cleaner and it's much closer to, it doesn't still respect all of the control flow primitives, because you cannot just simply, you know, wrap it up in a try-catch like this, because it's not going to work. Instead of doing it this way, now in one single point, but, you know, all we have to do now is just to add this dot catch in one single point to gain in our operations. Let me undo this code and show you the final piece, and we are gonna continue in the next session from this point. The final part of this session is promise such a yes. This get JSON that we have here and get JSON sync. If you remember, no, sorry. This is not, okay. Give me the result. The reason that I had to, you know, create this function is because read file, I cannot change the read file. Read file is still using callbacks, but I can wrap it up. You know, this is the get JSON. I can wrap it up all in a promise like this. All you have to do is just to wrap everything that you had in a new, you know, in a promise like this. No, you no longer need that callback argument. Or now it is much better because get JSON function only receive one single parameter, which is the actual argument of the function, not any type of callback, but it doesn't return the actual value of that file, actual JSON. What it returns is the promise of that. If you could just take a look at this, I no longer need to add this try catch. If any error happens, this promise is going to be rejected automatically. I don't have to do that. I don't have to add this try catch anymore. So I don't have to check that manually. The only part that I still need to check, because Node.js fs.read file is based on callbacks, is this point. I have to reject the promise manually because I am notified of that error manually. So using callbacks. So this is a mix because fs.read file is using callbacks, but I don't want to use callbacks. I return a promise. That promise receives a function. This part is might sound a bit confusing, but it's not actually. When you to create a new function, you have to pass a function, excuse me, to create a new promise, you have to pass a function to that. And that function is going to receive resolve two parameters. And both of these two parameters are function, resolve and reject. The point is, this function is sort of, this function that you pass to new promise is sort of similar to the concept of a callback. But what we do with it, it's not at all similar to a callback. It is totally different. So what it does, it receives two parameters, resolve and reject. If this error happens, what we want to do is just to reject the promise. we no longer need to do try catch, because this new promise itself, the promise object itself, is going to handle this. If any error happens here, because we have wrapped everything inside this function, that error is going to end up inside this, promise chain as a catch. So now if I want to call this getJSON function, all I have to do is just similar to what we had here called sync, that all I had to do to get the error was to add this catch block, which is the standard control flow primitive. Now, it's not standard, but it is much cleaner, and it is really close to the standard control flow primitive. All we have to do is just to, as you see, add this .catch to get the error. If you have a scenario, you could have different, then and then you can have different workflows using .thens. You could, return the result of this function like this, and then you could call this call async function to, as part of your scenario, and it allows you to have a much cleaner code, and you no longer need to do if error, just to check it again. This is all you had to do now, similar to what we had, an asynchronous operation here. If you recall right here, we have a lot of this if error, we have 4 points. But if we implement getJSON using a promise similar to this process, what we have here, there is one single point that we check for error, which is here .catch. Again, that's why using promises allows us to, have a much cleaner code. Okay, that's it. I managed to finish what I had in mind, what I had planned for the session. But it seems the time I had expected to be for this part, for this topics to be finished much sooner. But now I guess at this point, we are going to cover your questions if you have any. Let's just get back to this. Okay, guys, I'm all here now. I'm all ear, and I could get your questions, and we could talk about any possible questions you might have. Okay. Any questions? No? Okay. No questions. Awesome. So I hope you have enjoyed this workshop. But yeah, as you could see in the code base and my notes, I have really tried my best to do it in a way that it is comprehensive for different types of users, for for beginners and for those who are familiar with the basics of Node.js, and also for those who are more advanced developers familiar with Node.js and all the great stuff. So sorry if it was a really long workshop, but if you are interested, the second session is not going to be boring, because we are not going to cover callbacks again. Callbacks, usually talking about callbacks means dealing with all these different types of issues. But when it comes to promises, and in the next sessions, function generators, and then async await, it's much more interesting, and usually attendees enjoy more when we cover these types of topics. Okay, great. I hope you have enjoyed this session, and have a great day. and bye. Oh, by the way, you could, I usually upload the recorded video of all of these sessions in my YouTube channel. The YouTube channel that I have is called JavaScript Mentor. And you could, this is the address. I have also uploaded other sessions of my other workshop, React workshops, and in the channel, you could find it here. And that's it. So I'm going to upload this session as well as soon as I could. Have a great day, and see you in the next session if you join, actually. Have a great day. Bye.